Hello, listeners. This is Kat, and welcome back to Put Your Hands Up Podfics. This will be the continuation of When One Thing Ends, Another Can Begin. This will be Part 11, Chapter 6, the second part. The 15 minutes of prep time were over, and the teams now watched each other from where they were stationed at the edges of the arena. They were all on edge, waiting for midnight to declare the start of the match. Hatsume fidgeted from her position as rider, while Izuku was resisting the urge to do the same, especially considering he was locking arms with Uraraka, and one wrong move could result in her accidentally using her quirk on him. Shinso was the only one that seemed unaffected by the atmosphere, but Izuku knew that he wanted to win this just as badly as they did. After all, that was the reason he'd agreed on their plan and become the front horse, even though it might cost him. Midnight raised her whip into the air, 42 pairs of eyes following the movement. She brought it down as a siren signaled the start of the round, and all hell broke loose as the other teams immediately went for them. And so began the most chaotic team event Izuku had ever been a part of, and the first one he'd done with people who wanted to be on his team. The first team to reach them was comprised of 1B students, their rider reaching out to try and grab their headband as they ran. They were close to reaching, but had to fall back when one of Hatsume's machines used a grabbing claw to steal their headband, turning the attack into a short game of tug-of-war. Hatsume laughed maniacally from above them, daring everyone near them to challenge her babies, the invention strapped to her body elevating the image of a mad scientist. Her cackling was broken by Uraraka shouting, "My side!" Just as they'd planned, Izuku shifted to take on most of Hatsume's weight, leaving Uraraka free to tap the other team with her quirk. She didn't try to trip any of them or push them away, given that doing so could get them disqualified under the rule that maliciously attacking another team with the intent of making them fall is not allowed. But rapidly removing and restoring gravity could still make them stumble and think twice about getting close. Once Uraraka locked arms with them again, they were off at full speed. There was yelling all around them, shoving and shouting, but they kept running through all of it. Their first secret weapon came into play when they started sinking into the arena, one of the 1B teams approaching them. It was clear that the student with the exposed teeth was the one using his quirk to stop them, so Shinso called out to the team before they could get too close. Of course, not knowing Shinso's quirk, the boy and one of the team members responded, falling into Shinso's control. From there, it was easy for him to get the boy to release his quirk and let them go. Free once more, they ran past the other team, snagging their headband while the others were busy trying to snap their teammates out of Shinso's control. Izuku knew that Shinso had been hoping to keep his quirk a secret so he might be able to use that to his advantage in the third round, and probably didn't want more people calling him a villain, given that was the go-to insult whenever people learned of his quirk. But if they wanted to actually make it to the third round, then that was the price he would have to pay. They managed to avoid a few more grabs for their headbands, 3 now, if Izuku had been keeping track correctly, until they were trapped between teams, unable to dodge a hand going for the one around Hatsume's neck. Of course, as soon as the tips of their fingers were close enough to reach the band, they jerked back. The crack of electricity arced and followed the movement for a moment before disappearing once more. Hatsume had said the voltage would be safe, just a nasty sting, but while that was the case for the people reaching for the bands, Izuku didn't think it was safe to have near her head. However, as soon as he'd suggested tampering with one of her babies to create some sort of electric shock as a defense mechanism, she'd thrown herself into the idea and now had a high-voltage hazard strapped to her body. Was it dangerous? Probably. But the support student had been determined to reach the third round, and Izuku wasn't the best person when it came to avoiding bad but effective ideas. Their last line of defense being effective didn't change the fact that they were still trapped. They were faced with Shoji running full speed at them, Tokiyami beside him, with Tsuyu as their rider. While the electricity might be enough to ward off Tsuyu if she used her tongue, it definitely wouldn't be enough to stop Dark Shadow. So, time for secret weapon number 2. Now! At his shout, Uraraka slapped Hatsume's hand, who used her jetpack to immediately shoot up into the air. Without her body weight, she was sent flying, only staying in control of her trajectory with the help of her hover boots. It was a risky move, given that they didn't have any sort of tether for Hatsume, so she would be on her own, in the air. But it was one of their only options given their lack of combat ability. Several other teams went after her, Bakugo being the loudest and most noticeable, his explosions hot on her trail. And it was as they were about to intercept that Izuku shouted the second command, that it was part of their plan. Drop! With that, Uraraka tapped her fingers together and released Hatsume, who began falling rapidly without the jetpack to keep her suspended in the air. The result was a bunch of students overshooting their mark and running into each other, instead of reaching Hatsume. Izuku was too preoccupied by trying to weave through the team members still grounded to appreciate a plan gone right. Leaving the unit was allowed, so long as the rider's feet didn't touch the ground, and the horse formation could be broken. So, as the fastest of the three, it was Izuku's job to catch her to prevent them from being disqualified. With seconds to spare, he managed to grab Hatsume from the air, knees almost buckling as he took on her weight and the weight of the invention strapped to her. "Not bad, first place." Izuku just gave her a strained smile as she maneuvered herself out of his arms and onto his back. Uraraka and Shinso wouldn't be too far off, so they'd be able to reform their horse eventually, but for now, Izuku focused on running once again. They were going pretty well, the 10 million points in their possession, and the only loss being the jetpack, which had decided to go on the fritz with 6 minutes left, until Todoroki sectioned them off with a giant ice wall. The limited space made running away much harder, which was probably the dual-haired boy's plan. Their teams stared each other down in their private arena, the sounds of the other teams fighting muffled by the ice. "Well, looks like this'll be easy." The other team stayed silent as Shinso talked, wary of his quirk. "Kaminari's already lost it. Way, am I right?" Apparently that was enough to get a reaction out of the still responsive Kaminari, who immediately began protesting to prove he wasn't short-circuited, only to immediately fall under Shinso's control. "Shock your teammates." Before he could finish the command, Todoroki hit the back of Kaminari's head, bringing him out of the mind control. "Shit." Izuku could agree with Shinso's muttered statement. Time was ticking down, which was definitely good for them, but Todoroki's team was still an active threat. Ida was saying something too quiet for them to hear across the space, the other team shifting as if to hold tighter to one another, and Izuku realized what he was about to do. Izuku's shout of, "Now!" overlapped Ida's, "Recipro burst!" Hatsume was launched into the air, weightless and propelled by both Uraraka and Izuku putting their full force behind throwing her. At the same time, the Todoroki's team took off. In that same second, Izuku realized it wouldn't be enough. Yayorozu was creating something, and that something could probably be enough to grab Hatsume, especially with the aid of Todoroki's ice. So he preemptively let out his breath and dropped. He was halfway to the ground when Ida hit him. If he'd been able to see, he'd have watched their whole team stumble and veer off course, all efforts diverted to staying upright rather than making a grab for Hatsume. Unfortunately, he was more preoccupied by being knocked backwards and sent rolling, not enjoying the feeling of becoming a human speed bump for the second time. He tried to ignore the feeling of not being able to breathe and scrambled up to his feet. Just because one attack had been stopped didn't mean their fight was over, and Hatsume was still vulnerable in the air. Uraraka and Shinso were already on top of things, positioned under Hatsume even as they asked if he was okay. He couldn't verbally reply, considering he was still relearning how to make his lungs work, but he gave them a thumbs up and motioned for Uraraka to release her quirk. The three of them caught Hatsume, spinning to face Todoroki's team, when the impossible happened. The timer went off and signaled the end of the match. It wasn't a second too soon, with Bakugo exploding through a section of the ice wall, but Izuku didn't care about that when the scores were shown on the screen. Team Hatsume, 10,370 points. "I guess we're all first place now, huh?" Shinso's monotone voice couldn't hide the fact that there was a large grin on his face as he turned to the rest of them. "My wonderful baby's got us through. The support companies will have to pay attention to that." Hatsume began ranting, talking about opportunities and companies and what she'd like to make next, while the other three tuned her out. Izuku felt tears gathering behind his eyes as he cheered their victory with his friends. Of course, one of their friends wasn't there, instead standing with a different team, who had been fortunate to pass with the headbands they had. He blinked away the tears before they could fall and said a quick goodbye to Uraraka and Shinso, heading over to where Ida was talking to the others. "Hey, Ida." Izuku waited for Ida to step away from the other three. "I'm sorry for tripping you like that again." Ida immediately began swinging his arms around, which was a good sign he wasn't injured from Izuku's stunt. "While it certainly wasn't ideal, I should have known you would have pulled a similar maneuver to the one you used during the battle trials." "Most people wouldn't. I just knew you had something up your sleeve with all the training you've been doing, and it's impossible for me to be faster than you, so the only way to deal with that is to make you slower." He paused, feeling on edge as he asked. "No hard feelings?" Ida was his friend, but he was also someone with a powerful quirk that Izuku had essentially beaten via tripping during a big event. There was a high chance that Ida could be angry or embarrassed over it. And now that the adrenaline was fading from the event itself, Izuku was more than a little afraid that it might cost them their friendship. "If we face each other during the third round, then I'll be sure not to fall for a similar trick," Ida quickly replied, no sign of agitation present. And Izuku felt relief wash through him. Now please see Recovery Girl. I know that impact would have hurt. He felt less relieved at the thought of having to bother Recovery Girl over a couple bruises. As the two of them rejoined Uraraka and Shinso, the scheming Hatsume tagging along with them, he let himself smile and join in their banter, ready for the break that lunch would bring and the chance to plan it would give him. If he had looked back, he would have noticed heterochromatic eyes watching him intently, as if trying to figure out a difficult puzzle. But Todoroki had his own problems and preparation to worry about, so he let himself forget about the quirkless boy. Tomura slouched further into his chair as the ad scrolled across a screen. Useless propaganda. He would have turned the television off and destroyed the remote if Kurogiri hadn't confiscated it as soon as the sports festival started. The only reason he hadn't stood up and destroyed the television itself was because Sensei had told him to watch it and pay attention to the stupid little hero hopefuls. At least it was a break from thinking about Stain. They'd thought the hero killer might actually have some worth and be someone willing to join their cause, but instead, Tomura had just gotten insulted and given a new stab wound. Who the fuck takes a step back from killing heroes? It was ridiculous, Stain talking about ideals and conviction and calling Tomura childish for trying to destroy this useless society while Stain admitted that he had changed his goals because some friend said he could do better than killing heroes. Rival of heroics his ass, Stain was just another fucking coward who had let himself be convinced heroes were so good and pure and would save you no matter what. Actually, the sports festival hadn't been a very good distraction at all when it came to thinking about heroes, especially when a certain green quirkless wannabe piece of shit had started becoming the focus of the whole event, winning the first two events. Tomura hated him, wanted to destroy him, but he had to respect how well he'd been able to hide whatever secret let him face off against all these powerful quirks and win. There was no way he was just an ordinary quirkless kid. Of course, that meant he probably had a subtle quirk, and if it was quirks he wanted to know more about. Sensei. Yes, Tomura. There was a slight distortion from the speaker. Sensei's voice came through, but it was still a comfort to hear it, to have answers always within reach. What quirk does Midoriya have? There was a pause before Sensei answered, and the weight had him scratching at his neck once more. From what you've told me and what I can see, the boy is quirkless. Of course, if you wanted to find out more, you could always approach him and ask. You seem to have maintained your interest in him. That wasn't the answer he was looking for. If he was going to track down the kid, he would eventually track them all down as he destroyed all heroes and their miniature student counterparts. Then it would be to slowly pull them apart, not ask stupid questions. But if he could figure out how Midoriya did it, then maybe he could use that to the League's advantage. He would have to keep that in mind for the next time he was face to face with the green stain of a person. They'd been joking at lunch, trying to keep the mood up before they'd moved on to planning and bouncing strategies off each other. Of course, Izuku had ended up doing most of the talking during that time, but the others hadn't seemed to mind. Now, both he and Shinso were silent, watching each other from the opposite ends of the arena. They hadn't really said anything to each other since the pair-ups had been revealed. Izuku wished that Shinso's quirk had nothing to do with his choice to stay silent, but he wanted to do well in this round. He wanted to win. Of course, he knew that would never happen, but he was going to get as close to the podium as his scarred hands could drag him. So, he'd been silent, and stayed silent, barely exchanging a glance with his friend until Midnight brought her whip down and started the match. Izuku wasn't a fighter. That was the first thing that came to his mind as he ran at Shinso. He knew some self-defense, and how to completely disable an opponent. But the sports festival wasn't really the place to use eye gouges, throat strikes, and attempts to break knees. It definitely wasn't something Izuku was willing to use against his friend. As he got closer, preparing to tackle, hit, throw Shinso, the boy started speaking. At first, it was jokes. They were pretty good, all things considered, but Izuku had a lot of practice ignoring jokes, considering he'd been a punchline, sometimes literally, of so many for so long. They grappled after Izuku's first swing went wide, Shinso using his height to his advantage while Izuku attempted to make use of his shorter stature to disrupt Shinso's balance and throw him. Wrestling back and forth, the occasional swing thrown in between, the jokes became far more barbed, until they turned into insults and mockery. But for how clever and creative Shinso was, none of what he said, the jokes, the insults, the insinuations, none of them were new. So Izuku stayed silent, even as Shinso kept trying to get any reaction out of him. Izuku was feeling a bit worse for wear by the time Shinso was almost at the edge of the arena, slowly corralled by trips and shoves and elbows thrown while his guard was down. The other boy had managed to get a direct hit to his face at some point, and Izuku could feel the blood running from his nose, trying to avoid it getting in his mouth as he breathed heavily. "You really won't respond to anything, will you?" Shinso managed to shove him a few steps away, but Izuku twisted under his arms to get back into his space before he could push his advantage. "I bet you had this plan ready to go ever since you learned what my quirk was." Izuku took a sharp breath. Shinso didn't seem to notice, though, still talking, never stopping his constant, one-sided conversation. "Of course, I don't blame you. After all, who'd ever want to be friends with a villain? I'm always one word away from completely controlling you. That's fucked up, right?" Izuku kicked out at one of Shinso's ankles, trying to get him to flail and step back, to get this match over with, so Shinso would stop talking about himself like that. But instead he managed to step to the side and throw another sloppy punch. "You know, I'm only in the hero course because you took pity on me. I only got this far in the tournament because of you too, riding on the coattails of someone else's success, just like a villainous leech." Shinso grabbed Izuku's wrist, as he mistimed a jab, too focused on gritting his teeth and staying silent. How pathetic is that? If Shinso had been anyone else, Izuku might have been able to ignore the self-deprecating monologue, but that final statement was said with so much conviction and sadness that Izuku just couldn't let it lie. Shinso was his friend, someone he trusted, someone who was more heroic than most of the kids Izuku had ever encountered, and been praised for their heroic potential. So he stepped past his friend, twisted his grip, and brought across his other hand to latch into Shinso's arm, and threw him over his shoulder with the movement. "Shinso is out of bounds! Midoriya wins!" Cheers filled the stands, Shinso looking up at them from where he lay half over the boundary line. "You're not a villain, and you're not pathetic, Shinso." He offered a hand to the slightly dazed boy. "It's not a bad thing to need help or to want it." That felt like a lie, considering the views he had grown up with, and only recently realized he'd internalized. But he felt like it was what Shinso needed to hear. He was starting to get more worried the longer Shinso lay half propped up on his elbow, staring at his hand, until Shinso finally spoke. "Did you just throw me, winning the match just because I was talking shit about myself and you wanted to be nice?" Shinso moved his stare from Izuku's hand to his face. "After some of the absolute shit I said to you?" Izuku shrugged, hand still outstretched. "It's not like I haven't heard it before." Shinso grimaced, before finally taking his hand and pulling himself up. "You know," he said, speaking quietly as they walked off the arena platform together, "you shouldn't have ever heard that stuff in the first place." "And you should never have been called a villain for your quirk." They shared a small smile, maybe not finding joy in their shared awful past, but at least finding some comfort that they had each other now. It was with that knowledge and comfort that they walked back up to the stands and rejoined their class, and were immediately asked to go back down to see Recovery Girl by both Ida and Yaoyorozu, with enough reassurance he was fine, and insisting it was important to see what happened next. They were allowed to stay, though Izuku could have used an ice pack if he was being honest. Sitting up in the student section, he leaned forward in his seat, notebook being rapidly devoured by words as he watched the next matches intently. He knew that he could be facing any of them in the next bracket. Technically, some had better chances of winning their matches than others, especially when quirks were compared against each other. So it was important to get as much information as possible. Watching Sero go against Todoroki and end up in a glacier was scary, to say the least. On his own, he had no way to combat power like that. But that was true for any moderately powerful quirk, and it was for that reason that he'd been brainstorming on how he could stand a chance against Todoroki's quirk, or any powerful quirk like it, since he'd seen it in action during the battle trials. There were depressingly few options, but they did exist. He kept them in the back of his mind, trying to decide which would be best in his next match, while he observed the rest of the matches. Seeing Kaminari taken out so quickly during his match reminded Izuku that he needed to talk to him about directing his quirk so that he wouldn't have to use his indiscriminate bursts, and to also investigate why he short-circuited. It didn't seem healthy, or something that an electric quirk user should have trouble with. Shiozaki was very interesting to watch, and raised all sorts of questions about her quirk, such as how much control over her vines she had, did she have sensation in them, and how fast could they grow back. Ida and Hatsume's match was definitely interesting. Pretty entertaining, all things considered, but Izuku would never say that to Ida's face, since it was probably humiliating for his friend to be led around like that. Hopefully he'd learned that people weren't always so upstanding or rule-abiding as he was. The match between Ashido and Iwase was also pretty interesting, as Iwase seemed to have a contact-based quirk, while Ashido's quirk meant getting into contact with her could be a really bad idea. With no other materials to use his quirk on, Iwase suffered a pretty big loss to Ashido, but both seemed pretty good-natured about it as they shook hands before leaving the arena. It took until Hananuki and Yaoyorozu's match for someone to comment on his note-taking. He was enraptured by the two recommendation students and the way they combated each other given their wildly different quirks when Uraraka leaned over. "What are you doing?" He glanced at her for only a second before Yaoyorozu drew his attention again by creating a set of stilts to combat Hananuki's quirk. "Making notes. On the matches are the quirks." He paused for a second, considering the notes he was making. They were very quirk-focused, but also worked as a bit of a personality and fighting style profile. "Both, I guess?" Uraraka nodded, sagely beside him. "That makes sense, though I guess part of me thought you already knew everything about everyone at this point." He laughed sheepishly, rubbing the back of his neck with his unoccupied hand. "There's always more to learn." "Hell yeah, there is!" Uraraka clapped her hands and leaned forward in imitation of his earlier pose. "Now, who's going to win this match?" He gave her a look, somewhere between confusion and resignation, but she didn't back off for a moment. "What? You could do it back at the battle trials. Why not here?" Giving her another second to change her mind and finding her still waiting, he turned his attention back to the current match and began to talk as he took notes. He kept up his quiet commentary through Yaoyorozu's victory and was mildly surprised at the draw of Tetsutetsu and Kirishima's match. And then Uraraka had to leave for her own match. She looked nervous as she said her goodbyes, and their other classmates cheered her on, not having to worry about Bakugo's reaction as he'd left to get ready early, and wished her luck. Izuku just gave her what he hoped was a reassuring smile. "Remember, you can control gravity itself. You'll do great." "Yeah, beat him up." Shinso piped up from the several chairs he'd claimed as a napping space. Ida admonished him for putting the statement so crudely, and Izuku let the chatter of those two and his other classmates fade into the background as he watched Uraraka leave. When their match began, Izuku couldn't take his eyes away. He'd encouraged Uraraka and knew that she'd do well, but Bakugo would be the winner of this match. He didn't have any other option, especially not after the declaration he'd made in his athlete's oath. So when he exploded her incredible rebel shower and won, he wasn't surprised. But it had definitely been a far closer ending than he'd expected, with that explosion pushing the very limits of Bakugo's quirk. The explosion had been powerful enough that some of the smaller bits of rubble had made their way into the stands. No one seemed to be hurt by it, given the general lack of outcry, but it was still impressive to find a small chunk of singed concrete right by his seat. With his own match coming up next, as soon as they'd repaired the arena, he tucked the bit of rubble into his pocket and snuck away from the stands into the waiting rooms. He didn't want to hear the empty good luck wishes and didn't want anyone to follow him as he made a slight detour on his route to check on Uraraka. When he got there, knocking on the door to give her a little warning before he opened it, she was clearly trying not to cry. He decided to keep it short, because no one likes an audience as they cry. "You did amazing, Uraraka. You're going to be a hero to watch out for." She gave him a wobbly smile in return. "Thanks. Your match is next, right?" He gave her a small nod in acknowledgement, still forcing his nerves down. "Well, good luck." He thanked her, because he'd definitely need it, before turning to leave her in privacy. However, before he took a step, he turned back, brain doing flips, trying to figure out if this was going to be a good decision. He offered her a hug. That was how he found himself hugging someone who wasn't his mom for the first time since he was 4. The times people hugged him briefly, for dares didn't count. It was quick, but it was nice. They were interrupted by her phone going off, so Izuku took the opportunity to excuse himself and begin the nerve-wracking wait for his match against Todoroki, preparing in the few ways he could. His hands were clenched tight as he walked out to the arena, trying to focus on just keeping his breathing even. Now was not the time to shake or shut down. Todoroki said nothing as they faced off. He just watched him with a cold indifference, and really, Izuku couldn't blame him for it. After all, what threat was the quirkless kid to the one who could make and melt glaciers? Izuku adjusted his stance as Midnight went over the rules again, widening his stance but keeping on the edge of his toes, his body at a slight angle to Todoroki. Midnight brought her whip up. Izuku watched as Todoroki readjusted his own stance. Izuku loosened his fist. Midnight brought her whip down. Izuku had a few seconds, less than that, probably, but Todoroki's large-scale attacks needed a few seconds to build up properly. So the moment Midnight brought her whip down, Izuku brought his arm up, a makeshift sling made out of his ripped undershirt trailing behind, and the chunk of concrete from Uraraka and Bakugo's fight went flying towards the other boy. He didn't wait to see if it hit its mark. throwing himself to avoid any incoming attacks. To his horror, he was a second too late, ice wrapping around his foot before he could escape. In a panic, not wanting the fight to end here, he ripped his foot out of the ice, immediately feeling something shift and twist in a way it wasn't meant to. That didn't matter, though. He was out and on the move, ready to zigzag away from the next attack that never came. Across from him, Todoroki Shoto was lying on the cold concrete out of the arena, unresponsive, taken out by the full force of his attack that could be generated. That was probably why only one of Izuku's feet had been trapped. He looked at Todoroki, the top student of their class, out of the fight within seconds. He'd used a part of his shirt and the chunk of concrete, technically part of the arena, even if the damage had been fixed, so he couldn't be accused of bringing in outside resources to fight, but he hadn't really expected it to work. The ice spread on the arena gently cracked as it settled and began to melt in the sunlight, the stadium silent. Midnight looked between both him and Todoroki, opened her mouth, closed it, then looked between the two of them again. Midoriya wins? It came out as more of a question, but Izuku didn't have much time to question her indecision, as the whole stadium burst into violent clamoring. All right, listeners, this concludes the second part of Chapter 6. The last section for Chapter 6 will be up next. I hope you all are still enjoying this one. I really like how the author did this sports festival, so I'm eager to hear your thoughts and reactions to everything with this one as well. And as always, thank you so much for listening.